And good evening. My name is Kimberly Stewart, board member with the Laguna Beach Historical Society. And I'd like to welcome you all this evening to the Laguna Beach Historical Society program. It is Tuesday, May 28th, 2013, for the record. This program is being recorded by Cox Communications. We are so grateful for that. Anne Marie McKay is in the back taking care of this for us and will eventually provide us with a DVD recording of this program, along with a host of others that we've recorded that are available with a donation at the Murphy Smith Bungalow. I'd like to thank our membership for the vote at our last program at the end of April last month for voting in the slate of the board members. And I'd like to welcome once again new board member Ed Stork. So thank you so much for joining the board. And I'd like to congratulate our new president, Karen Smith, and our new vice president, Greg DeNicola. I don't think that either one of them were available to be here this evening, but also Nelda Stone, continuing on as our secretary, and Jean Felder, continuing on as our treasurer. So thank you for that. Again, I'm filling in for our new president, Karen Smith, this evening, but I know I speak for her when I thank all of our members, our business members, and the different organizations, but especially the City of Laguna Beach. But I am, at this point, going to thank, because I think this is a really neat opportunity to do this, our business members. And Wells Fargo Bank, of course, is the organization, the institution that leases us the Murphy Smith Bungalow at $1 a year, which has been gratefully received for, since 1992. Anyway, we have Caduceus Medical, H.J. Baker and Brothers, Inc., Andy Allison Bungalow Hunters, Ann Christoph Landscape Architect, Orthwick Guy Bettenhausen Landscape Architects, Butler Box, Charles's Wig Chateau, Chicago Title, Emerald Bay Community Association, Indiana James Limited Partnership, Dr. Corey Jorgensen, Ken's Jewelry Store, Laguna Beach Visitors and Conference Bureau, Laguna Broadcasting Network, Gail Waite Realtor, Reynolds Carpet, Sawdust Festival, Stewart's Landscaping, and Teller Architects, and the Stand Natural Foods Restaurant, all of whom are business members of the Laguna Beach Historical Society. We are grateful for your continuing dedication and participation. An announcement, we are making some great progress with the list of improvements that were requested and listed at our very first inspection by Wells Fargo Bank. We're grateful to those that have been making contributions, donations, and in-kind contributions, in lieu contributions to our building and maintenance fund. And if you are so interested and motivated, we will welcome any further contributions to support that way. Our tax ID number is on the bottom of our newsletter, which you likely have received, or you might find one in the back of the room at the back table next to the sign-in sheets. I want to just move right ahead with the program, and I have the great pleasure of introducing our board member, Jean Felder, who is also on the board of directors, vice president of the Laguna Canyon Conservancy, who was also at the time on that board at the time of this, the date of the program that's being presented tonight, or the topic. And so with that, unless you would like for me to go ahead and read this, if you would like to take it from here. Okay, Jean Felder, thank you so much.
Hey, welcome everybody. We appreciate you coming out tonight. I just wanted to clarify the maintenance fund. So if you have money to help us restore the Murphy Smith Bungalow, we would appreciate a monetary contribution. Now, you know, I have some problems. I'm allergic to manual labor, but I understand there are actually some people that can do things. So we would really seek I mean, if anybody's a roofer and would like to replace our roof, an in lieu contribution or something like that is what we're looking for. I do have a couple of announcements before we go to the program. That is, Arnold Haino has written a book, and I is an author too. So Arnold Haino's book, It Takes a Villager, may be available here tonight. He may be available to sign it. I'm up to page 112, and it is a hoot. So I would certainly recommend It Takes a Villager. Foster J. Eubank and I did this Arcadia Press, Laguna Beach Then and Now. So it's a historic photo, some information, and the current photo. And we have them available this evening. At the end of the program, I'm available for book signing. Announcements. Let's see, today's Tuesday, so two nights from now, May 30th, Thursday, at the Laguna Art Museum will be our buddy and board member Eric Jessen doing Edgar Payne, the various art sites. He goes out there tramping through the hillside trying to find exactly where Edgar Payne stood to do a painting. And then on June 7th, Friday from 6 to 9 o'clock, the South Laguna Community Garden Park is having a fundraiser. Now, that costs money, but it's to a good cause. I want to move on to the program here. Somebody who just wandered in and wondering what we're going to talk about tonight. It's the history of the negotiations of the 1990 Save Laguna Canyon bond measure. And the key thing there is that it required a two-thirds vote. And a two-thirds vote is not the easiest thing in the world to get. You would think, what's so hard about getting 66 and two-thirds plus one vote, particularly for a good cause. So in 1956, the first bond election for, this is just an example of how difficult it is, to buy Main Beach Park, to buy the land of Main Beach Park, it got 65% of the vote and failed, didn't get two-thirds. And then 4 years later, they tried it again to pass a bond measure to buy Main Beach Park, and it failed by less than 1% from the 66 and two-thirds required. So, of course, you remember that November 11th, 1989, led by the executive director, Harry Huggins, who's right here. The Laguna Canyon Conservancy supported, sponsored the Walk in the Canyon, but it was also co-sponsored by the Laguna Greenbelt, Village Laguna, the Chamber of Commerce, and the City of Laguna Beach. And so what I always like to say, it brought the Irvine Company to their negotiating knees. Actually, I like to say the Irvine Company, a Michigan corporation, was brought to its negotiating knees. But anyway, so our panel discussion is including Paul Freeman, Norm Grossman, Carol Mentor McDermott, and Mike Phillips, who just walked in. And they all served as representatives on the negotiations to purchase land in Laguna Canyon. Paul Freeman facilitated the Laguna Laurel negotiations that led to the Laguna Canyon purchase. Later on, using it as a stepping stone, he turned to politics, twice elected to the Laguna Beach City Council, twice serving as our mayor. Norm Grossman has served on the Laguna Beach Planning Commission since 1988, with 1 year gap from 2000 to 2001. He has been a board member of the Laguna Greenbelt Incorporated since 1984. So let's see, I know math is tough for a lot of people. 84, that's 16 plus 13. He's been on the Greenbelt board for 29 years, and 12 plus 13, 25 years, take away 1. So 24 years he's been serving the City of Laguna Beach on the Planning Commission, and I've noticed you've picked up a few things over the year, very detail-oriented. We knew Carol Hoffman, but Carol Mentor McDermott was in 1990 a corporate officer and vice president of entitlement and community relations for the Irvine Company. And Mike Phillips, the Laguna Canyon Conservancy actually had one paid employee once, and it was Mike Phillips, who at the time of the negotiations was the executive director of the Laguna Canyon Conservancy, and previous to that, he was a newspaper reporter for the Laguna Coastline newspaper. So let me turn it over to the panel. I think, Paul, you're going to lead us.
Say thank you first. I think this is so awesome that you all are here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very gracious introduction. It's nice to be here. Well, I don't know if it's nice to be here. I got up behind this microphone in this seat where I was on and off for some years on the council, and I broke into a cold sweat. It was really unpleasant, but I'm hoping it's a friendlier audience tonight.
Well, but Paul, you can imagine that a former executive of the Irvine Company never envisioned.
Okay.
I guess I got the power.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess you do.
Restless need.
Well, thank you to each of you for taking time out of your day and making it down here to City Hall. I see a lot of old friends. Nice to see you all here. Thank you for your interest and your involvement over the years. Hopefully this is a fun time, and we'll welcome questions. We don't have a lot finally prepared, but we had agreed among us, among we panelists, that we would kind of divide this into several parts. We'll talk a little bit about what set the stage for the negotiations, and then how we structured and managed those negotiations, what some of the big moments were, and some of the funny anecdotes we might be able to share, and then finally the campaign and what's happened since then. Because of the way this was billed, I think we'll focus a lot on the negotiating process and how we came to an agreement. But as I say, we'll frame that by talking about what set the stage, like from efforts by Harry and Elizabeth and the Greenbelt and the LCC, but we'll focus in on the negotiating. So I guess I would start by turning to Mike, who covered this first as a reporter, this issue of development in the canyon, and ask you, Mike, how would you characterize what happened leading up to the tell? Mark Chamberlain's here this evening. Hello, Mark. And the walk and all of that. But before that, how would you characterize, obviously there were years of controversy and litigation, but what was your sense of how it was shaping up, and did you ever envision there would actually be a facilitated discussion to try to reach a settlement?
Not only did I not anticipate it, I would never have anticipated having participated in any of it at all. That wasn't at all how I thought things would work out. I was working as a community news paper reporter and trying to get a feel for what all the issues were in Laguna Beach and what people really cared about. And the canyon was over and over the one issue that was the most exciting, and everybody seemed to have an opinion on, and there was a lot of history going back to other developments in Laguna Canyon, and then somewhere, excuse me, lurking out in the distance, the near distance, was this thing called Laguna Laurel, and it was hard to find out, well, what is Laguna Laurel? I couldn't really find a map. People said, well, you sort of drive out Laguna Canyon, and then once you get past the lakes, then you start looking on the right and the left, which you really shouldn't be doing at 50 or 65 miles an hour on a 1 or 2 lane road. But it was just an issue that came up over and over again, and then obviously the company was moving forward with a project. And for a newspaper reporter, there was just a lot of easy institutional news because things were happening as a process. There were hearings at the county on a development agreement. People were really starting to take it seriously. There were other issues that were sort of weighing in on the canyon. There were a couple of attempts to widen Big Bend, and there were several trips to the Coastal Commission to stop that. And every time they were successful, at least with the widening of Big Bend and the Coastal Commission, and then finally, Laguna Laurel was upon us. There was a development agreement with the county. It was adopted. Oh, yeah, and I forgot a little thing called the toll road that people were talking about as well. So culminating up to the 1980s, suddenly there was the agreement signed with the Board of Supervisors. Everyone in everyone that I was talking to was mad at the Board of Supervisors. They had a lot of great stories there too. And then there were several lulls. The Laguna Greenbelt had been around for years and years. Suddenly, you were hearing from some new people, starting a new group, kind of first euphemistically referring to it as just Save the Canyon. And then gradually it became Laguna Canyon Conservancy. It was late December 1987. There was a meeting in the back of City Hall here with Lita Lenny saying, "I want to save the canyon, who's with me?" And a group of people saying, "I'm with you, let's do it." And I was writing like crazy, thinking, boy, this is going to be a great story. And it just built and built. Then there would be lulls. Nothing would be happening. Well, they're processing things over at the county. Who really knows? And about that time, Mark and Jerry came up with kind of a great performance art piece, The Tell. And it really got people out in the canyon every day working on this project that they put together, and sort of culminating with this idea of we really need to try and do something to buy the land, see if we can buy it from the Irvine Company. But first, we have to get their attention and have to find a way to show that we're really serious. And Harry Huggins and the Walk did that, and that sort of brought us to the point where we sat down for negotiations.
I guess I'll turn next to Norm and then go to Carol. Norm, the Greenbelt had challenged the environmental impact report and the development in general. The Greenbelt lost, but was appealing that.
Exactly.
And did you feel, from the environmentalist point of view, that there was any leverage having lost that suit? Did you think you'd win on appeal? And what did you envision, or what did the group envision generally, the LCC and the Greenbelt, about what a negotiating process might look like?
Well, from my point of view, having been through a previous lawsuit against what became Aliso Viejo, that in fact it was the first thing after moving to town. Just because I showed up at a couple meetings, I wound up president of Village Laguna when that lawsuit was being pursued. And what I learned there was, even though you win a lawsuit, eventually you lose. Because we won, it became case law, in fact, and yet within a year they had all they were building. Because winning an environmental lawsuit generally is a fix-a-ticket. So it's a good way to stop things, and if the economy turns, and I think a lot of environmental lawsuits are based on that, delay for long enough and hope the economy turns. It makes it unsuccessful. I think, personally, I had just been through a number of different negotiations. I was part of the slow growth movement in 1988, which failed, but the county was so panicked by that they formed a committee to work on a county plan, which eventually became the county growth management element, and learned that there were ways you could negotiate. And there were ways, as long as you took certain positions, and I became the reasonable, crazy environmentalist of the group. So I then got invited to be part of the Measure M group. And then that morphed into something else. There was a support group set up to support Measure M called Foundation for Consensus in Orange County. And that's actually how I got on the Laguna Laurel Advisory Committee, not as a Greenbelt member, but as this other type of a member. But having been through all those various county-led efforts, a certain amount of optimism in knowing that if you can get people to talk, there's always a chance that you can succeed.
Carol, I guess one question that people might have in light of this history, the county has approved the proposed development. There's a certified environmental impact report. It's been challenged unsuccessfully, albeit it was on appeal. Why was the company interested in sitting down when it seemed like you had everything going for you?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons that I'm happy to share, and part of it was that we had a plan approved that would have given us 3,200 homes, 2 golf courses, but 76% open space. And we really thought that we were doing the right thing in saving what we'd been led to believe was the most meaningful open space in the canyon. Well, the head of our development division felt that, the area where the golf course was, which was the flatter part of the canyon, was where God put his footprint, and he was a golfer. Well, that wasn't Laguna's idea of open space, and it wasn't the prevailing opinions. And so as we continued to look at an approved plan with an extensive amount of open space, we also recognized that we had development objectives throughout the county, and that as environmental groups were becoming much more effective in working together and supporting each other's interests, we wanted to be able to demonstrate that we could work with all kinds of constituencies and to let that perhaps work for us in other canyons and in other parts of the county. So the timing was sort of ironic, if you will, and I will say that we were just about ready to enter into a recession. And a recession always allows developers time to think and think differently and think in other ways. And so we thought, well, let's take a look at who the constituencies are here and how we might work with them. And if 78 or 76% open space is not enough, then we really ought to talk to the interested parties about buying the property. And it was sort of interesting because with all the years that I've been in development, if my client or my employer owns a lot of open space, somehow that belongs to everybody but him. But the open space in your yard belongs to you. And so there's a whole different perspective that enters into the picture. And as a result, we had a much greater responsibility for the way in which we worked with the community. So a combination of all those factors led to a greater receptivity to the idea of creative negotiations.
So in a way, tell me if you think this is fair to say, the fact that the company had these broader countywide interests, North Irvine, East Orange, what have you, really was helpful because, but for that, maybe there wouldn't have been the concern about, how is the dynamic going to evolve and play out, these environmental groups starting to coordinate. I mean, I think I was struck by how many people from outside Laguna Beach came to the march, and that must have been a consideration. I guess the recession, the way to translate that is, here's a way to get some fast dough that otherwise you'd have to wait for.
Well, there was nothing very fast about that dough, but yeah.
Norm or Mike, did you have a sense that the canyon was starting to serve as a rallying point for environmental minded people countywide, and that this was a platform somehow for?
Well, there was a definite effort to reach out for the walk, and I think one of Gene's pieces down there talks about the Save the Canyons, which was pushed very heavily during the walk as an attempt to appeal countywide, and there was talk at the time of this being the first of many marches through different areas. I'm curious if there was opposition in the company to holding negotiations at all, if there was some, or if it was just a general consensus.
Well, it's interesting because as we all sat together and sort of used our collective memory to remind each other of the many aspects of this negotiation, I actually do not remember opposition. Developers are always concerned about how to work with people that oppose you. And luckily, they entrusted me and my boss at the time, Gary Hunt, with the challenge of how to craft a discussion initially and then ultimately a negotiation that was going to be productive for all parties. And I think that's what I really liked about it, was it needed to be sort of a win-win. And for a long time, as I think you'll attest, Norm, the negotiations between developers and environmentalists was a win-lose. And I didn't want to be a part of win-lose, and you'd been losing. And so we needed to find a win for everybody. And I see a number of you out here in the audience tonight that were a part of that. Certainly Carolyn Wood stuck through all those meetings for many years, and Elizabeth Brown, of course. And so it required a new kind of negotiation.
We had also, and I just remember this, on that slow growth initiative, we spent a year negotiating with developers in the county to try to avoid an initiative. In fact, we were negotiating up to the time we filed the signatures, and the company was heavily involved in those.
Well, and the development agreements really came out of that initiative, because everyone was concerned that if we did not ensure our development rights, and there were a countywide initiative, that we could have been shut down for a long time. And we particularly felt harmed by that, because we provided a much greater, in our perspective, balanced plans for our communities. And I think that history will show that Mr. Brin has been very, very generous and very forward-thinking and very conservation-oriented in the amount of land that he has since then made available for public use, and in a way that has been contiguous and linkages created and so forth that, were perhaps even started by the kind of perspective that Laguna Beach brought to that table through the plans for the Greenbelt that was to surround your community.
Was there a defining moment where you all felt like, okay, now we really are going to be in a position to sit down and start negotiating? Was there a particular moment?
Well, I think when we hired you, that was the first indication that, okay, this could really happen. We actually have somebody who seems to have a lot of public policy and government experience, has ran several campaigns, and Paul really hit the ground running immediately, met every single person who he could meet, took every tour of everything that was worth seeing to try and understand what this was all about, met with all the groups to try and sort of test what our thinking was going to be. Initially, some of the meetings I was not confident that they were really going to go anywhere. It was my uninformed guess that the company they don't probably really take us that seriously, and what they're going to do is get us to a point where they can see, where they can demonstrate, and we'll discover for ourselves that we can't do it. And that was just simply a dollars issue. Is look, and I'm sort of jumping ahead, but we ended up getting an appraisal on the land, a fair market appraisal, and that was sort of the point where things got very serious, because now people have to start making choices. And I mentioned to Norm, Gary Hunt had an expression, threshold issue. And it was the first time that I'd ever heard it, but usually it was in the context of, well, you environmentalists, you may find out that you're up against a threshold issue where you're going to have to make a decision how badly you want this land and whether you can afford to live with this or live with that in order to get it. But slowly as we met and we kept working out the numbers and started looking at the pieces of property and trying to break it down into, okay, what is most important to us, what money can we reasonably raise, what are the sources. You spent a lot of time just beating the bushes trying to figure out, and I don't know how many meetings we had just listing money sources, potential grants, things that the legislature might be working on. Talking to legislators, is there any state money to be had somewhere? Is there something that somebody's not using? Maybe we could do another initiative. But then over time, coming up with something that when I knew we were serious was when we could start locating pieces of money, and then we could start attaching that to specific pieces of property. And Norm and I, we were talking about this. At least to my knowledge, the environmental community had never had a discussion of what does Save Laguna Canyon mean. It, from my standpoint, was pretty broad. no development in the canyon, no Laguna Laurel, no toll road, don't even talk to us about widening Big Bend or anything like that. I can remember one discussion where defining saving Laguna Canyon was everything out to the strawberry fields at the 405. And that caused some problems, at least early in the negotiations, because it forced us in the environmental camp to start trying to pare down some expectations of what we could really afford to buy. I can remember a particular meeting where the company said, look, here's the money that you can come up with. Maybe you can buy this, and but that looks like it's going to be it. And it was a catastrophe. The room went crazy, at least on our side. Lita was very upset suddenly. And what had happened is you took us to that logical step. We just weren't ready to really look at it at that second. And Norm used, out of the blue, Norm said, wait a minute, caucus. And just stop the meeting right then and there. I thought, we can do that? Well, hell yeah, why not? Let's stop the meeting. We're going to go and talk amongst ourselves for a second. And we were meeting in those horrible City Hall trailers. They were renovating City Hall. And at some other point, I'll talk about the difference between meeting at the Irvine Company facilities and meeting at the City Hall. But the meetings at the City Hall were horrible. Everyone was uncomfortable. The seats were terrible. There were never much in the way of goodies or anything like that. You had to walk 50 or 60 yards for a restroom. The chairs were terrible. The air conditioning didn't work. And everybody was irritable, and we said, let's just get out of this meeting without agreeing to anything and say, let's come back and talk about it. And partially my memory is a lot of those little moments where we would kind of run up to a crisis where maybe we didn't know what the next step was going to be. Well, let's just hold on a second.
It was an emotional roller coaster for a few months there, and I would say that, one issue touched on defining what it means to save the canyon. That sort of arcane thing consumed a lot of our early efforts. For example, okay, let's define the canyon. Well, we finally, because we knew we couldn't get that much, get our arms around that much money, Lita's vision from the strawberry fields down was just not going to happen. And so we came up with this definition. Well, what's the conventional meaning of a canyon? It's kind of how the water runs or what you can see. And so we finally, by default, but it happened to line up with how much money we had, or we thought we could have, we defined it in terms of watershed and viewshed, which in turn informed how we structured the sequencing of the parcel takedowns as reflected in one of the charts below me here. But I would say, the reason I was chosen, by the way, in my view, and maybe Carol, you can add to this, people used to say, well, how did you get chosen to do this? I said, well, I moved to California just a couple years ago, or before this whole thing started, in the late 80s. And so I was unknown, and I was everybody's second choice, which kind of established my position going forward politically. I think I was equally distrusted by all parties, or to quote Elizabeth Brown from an LA Times article that I saw for the first time in 20 years today when I was Googling, I was and I think this is verbatim, Elizabeth, I was the indispensable leak through which information flowed. I thought that was a really elegant description of shuttle diplomacy. But what is your recollection of how we got
Well, we thought it was very important that we have a facilitator. And the facilitator needed to be someone who was going to be capable of going back and forth between the big developer that everyone loves to hate and, the Laguna Beach community.
And the environmentalists that all the developers love to hate.
That's right, yes. And so we established a subcommittee. Elizabeth and Lita and I were on that committee, I think. And so we pulled together some known facilitator negotiators and Paul's name came to us, and so we set up a series of interviews, and we interviewed all three of these candidates, and while I think Lita at one point wanted a man named Harvey Englander, I was convinced that Harvey would not have been very successful in this kind of a setting. And so then Paul kind of came out as, and besides he was a Democrat. And so we felt we could work with him, and we felt that he could work with the Laguna Beach community, and that we would then have someone that could go back and forth between the two parties. And I think it proved, all of your controversial aspects notwithstanding, Paul, to have really been the right choice. And certainly the fact that you ended up electing him your mayor several times running.
Well, let's not drag that into it. Well, one of the things we did when we first got started was to establish some protocols and sort of analytical departure points. And for me, there were a couple crucial points worth noting. One was we decided to make great use of opinion research, and I know that polling likely voters is something that a lot of people look at askance, but we put great stock in it as kind of a reality check, and we decided there was no better way to start framing our discussions by trying to test, well, how aware are people, how committed are they in principle to open space preservation, to this property in particular, and finally, how willing are they to pay for it? And sometimes it's tricky just to draft the questions. And in my view, one of the, if I had to rank order, sort of, what were the non-trivial reasons for why we successfully reached a deal, is that we first had this experience of, a bunch of people around the table who didn't trust each other, in some cases didn't like each other, and we came up with, as one protocol measure, we decided there would be unanimity on every question in the poll. Now, this was really an extraordinary decision to make, but we felt it was important to get off on the right foot. And so a lot of time was spent drafting the questions. We would draft the questions, then we had a pollster who would vet them and rework them, and then we'd have another opera about the questions again at our next meeting.
And this was unwieldy because this was the entire county group.
Yeah, the first poll,
This was
we
a large
focused
number
on
of
the
people
county
on
at
the
large.
table.
Yeah.
And Mike and I talked about this today, that because he and I were coming from exactly opposite points on the poll, because the pollster Paul uses was trained as a physicist
And a statistician.
and insists on incredibly objective questions, and that was fine with me. I love that. And Mike was conveying to me notes he took that I was being a total pain by buying into that.
My view was, as long as you're going to be talking to people, why not try and persuade them a little bit on your side? And Norm wasn't
push questions. They come later.
Norm wasn't having any of that. He was being completely honest, and it just really annoyed me that day because he wasn't on our side that day. He was being objective, which.
Well, and I think what most people don't recognize, too, is that the importance of an objective poll is you're trying to get information that will help shape a campaign. And if the objective is to be successful, you have to really know how people are going to feel. And everybody in Laguna was going to say, sure, we want open space, but how many of them were going to be willing to say they would spend money to acquire it, and that they would accept a bill on their tax bill in order to do that? And if so, how much was it going to be? And that was a real critical part of those discussions. We needed the information.
We hedged our bets on that first poll because what we did is we polled the county, but then we had a much larger sample in Laguna Beach because we expected, we were pessimistic about the county and mildly optimistic about the city, so we oversampled in Laguna Beach. And the results were what we expected, actually.
Well, and interestingly, there was sufficient support countywide to make it credible to some of the supervisors.
Right.
And
55, right.
we had more than a majority support, appreciably less than the requisite 2/3, but enough so that I think we gained a credibility that we didn't have before that poll. And the group gained a way of working together by, just to hammer this point, because I just think it was so huge in terms of the dynamic of the group, we spent months learning to say yes to each other. I mean, there were a lot of questions in this poll. And we had to get to a point where everybody said yes to the questions, which also meant, yes, we'll live with the results. And I think that did a lot to set the stage for the difficult negotiations that ultimately we got to. One of the arcane things, besides defining what does it mean to save the canyon, what is the canyon, was this notion of value. And, we found out, I didn't find out right away, but I found out at some point during the process that the city council had told themselves, well, maybe we could go to $65 million on this deal, maybe. And that's with a lot of qualifications. We knew the Irvine Company was far away from that position. And we knew, as Mike had alluded to earlier, that we would need to do a fair market value appraisal to establish a starting point for the talks. What is the value of this property was a reasonable question to ask before we got into, can we make a deal? And most of us were not so wise about high finance. If you look at my finances, I clearly wasn't very knowledgeable about high finance. And there were these terms of art that we were throwing around, like present value, meaning, okay, maybe it's worth X, but first you got to incur all the costs to build it and develop it and sell it, and how long will it take to sell all those homes? But, it's like you can make $20 in 20 years, but what if I just give you $3 right now, which is the better deal? It's hard for people unaccustomed to that sort of exercise to get their head around what is present value. And so we actually decided as a group that we would have a little tutorial. And so we brought in, I forget who we brought in, but we brought in some guru.
Yeah, we had a financial expert at the company who worked on those kinds of issues a lot, come in, and very mild-mannered, very knowledgeable, and wasn't a big black suit that scared everybody. And Tom proceeded to share his expertise. But in addition to that, I wanted to share the fact that in choosing an appraiser, there are some people that say that MAI, which is a certification for appraisers like AIA is for architects, but MAI means made as instructed. Well, it was very important to us that it not be perceived as made as instructed by the Irvine Company, but rather that we would collectively choose a appraiser. We would agree upon the assumptions, because if you agree on the assumptions, you have to accept the results. So we went through a whole process of agreeing on the assumptions, which was not easy, and then looking at the various appraisers and the kinds of work that they had done and choosing one that would follow the assumptions that we had agreed upon. Leading us then, and the company knew that once we had an appraisal on the property that there would be a negotiation. And yet it had to be the base from the ceiling from which we would negotiate down. And so it was determined that the property was worth, because it was entitled, because it had a approved development agreement, it was worth 105. I was thinking so. 3, but okay. It was over $100 million. And needless to say, that was an awesome, to use my grandson's term, it was an awesome revelation, and one that seemed relatively unachievable. So we knew that the Irvine Company, when I say we, I've been gone from 13 years, but it still comes out as we. We knew that given that price, that there was some room to negotiate at that point. So we started doing our own internal calculations and how far could we take it down and how far could that price then be allocated to various option parcels, and what would be the value of those option parcels, and how to do two things: to give the best part of the land to the city, or to sell it to the city first, but keep the most developable parcel to the end. And I see everybody that worked with us on that, Elizabeth and Carolyn and so forth, recognizing that we were saving the most developable area, and that was next to Leisure World, now Laguna Woods. And we had chosen a committee to represent the various constituencies, so we had a representative from the county. Bob Fisher was terrific. And we had a representative from then Leisure World, and then the other representatives that we have mentioned, but the objective really was to have a broad base of skills included in the negotiations, in addition to the entities that were represented. And I think that, you know, out of all of it, the thing that made me the happiest was not only that we could come to a final agreement, but that we've ended up friends. And when I walked in here tonight and I got hugs from a lot of you, it really meant a lot to me.
I think it's important. We haven't explicitly said who else was negotiating. For the city, Bob Gentry, Lita Lenny, Ken Frank.
2 sitting council members and the city manager.
Mike was representing, at the time, actually, Mike was executive director of both the LCC and Greenbelt. So he was there in that capacity. Liz was representing the Greenbelt. Carolyn Wood, the LCC. Sandy Lucas, the Laguna Canyon property owners.
Cy Jones.
Cy Jones for Village Laguna.
Oh, Village Laguna, Cy Jones, yes.
Then we also initially
Susan
had...
Gallagher for
Ian Sage, Audubon.
Right, Audubon. There was a Sierra Club person initially, the city of Irvine.
But they dropped off again.
They dropped off when we shifted our focus from the county to the city.
And I just hung around when we shifted. I became Liz's alternate, so I just kind of hung around.
Well, Liz was smart. She went to Australia or something like that. I forget what it was.
It was a very key point there where she had to delegate. It was hard, I know.
But, you know, one of the things in the, you know, part of the backdrop, which we mentioned earlier, was the resolution of the Greenbelt lawsuit, which was hanging over everything. Another elephant in the room was the toll road, which Mike mentioned, and there was no way to approach the negotiations other than to set that aside and pretend it didn't exist, much to the chagrin of toll road opponents and proponents. We just decided we pretended it just wasn't there. And then also part of the thing that was hanging over us was certain provisions of the county development agreement for the county-approved Laguna Laurel project. And in fact, initially, and that development agreement included certain public benefits like transportation improvements. And initially, the company's position, after we went through the fair market value appraisal, we had the opinion research. So when we finally got down to some brass tacks, the first offer from the company was, okay, it's appraised at a little over $100 million. We'll take 90, and somebody else has to pay the $30.2 million in transportation improvements under the county development. So we're really looking at, if we had taken that seriously, like $120 million, and that was a dramatic first position. We knew we couldn't get even halfway there, in all probability. But we then started talking about how we could solve the problem, and Carol mentioned Bob Fisher from the county. Norm, why don't you describe what kind of shift occurred when Bob went from, he was former like planning director, right?
Right, and
so he had been associated with development.
And the environmental community, because he was planning director, viewed him as the enemy. And we had $4 million from Prop 70, because the Greenbelt had been written in because we collected, I think, 30,000 signatures. And PCL, Planning Conservation League, used to have a deal where if you collected enough signatures, they'd write you into their bond tax. Since been made illegal by the legislature. Yeah,
it worked quite well for a while.
It worked very well. So, and we had $10 million, and we had $4 left over. And the city council had decided that they could raise another $5 million by parking revenue bond. So we're sitting at $9 million. Bob Fisher then informs us that he's gone to Supervisor Riley and gotten approval to pledge $2 million a year for 5 years. So $10 million. And all of a sudden, we're looking at real money. And all of a sudden, you can just feel a shift of, well, now things are beginning to sound reasonable. Now,
well, it was the hard cash, the $2 million a year for 5 years, $10 million, and then it was the agreement to manage the property
Yes.
for 50-some years.
And our view of him shifted 180. And I know some of you knew became the first head of Friends of Harbors, Beaches, and Parks. You know, he went from this perceived villain to the perceived hero status like in a night. And we're all going, you know, what happened? You know, road to Damascus type things, what's that happened to him? But it's probably, we misjudged it. I mean, again, that was just this judging people by actions that are taken and not who they are.
Well, and he has since passed away from cancer, and I miss him because he was really a colleague and a real true professional who was able to look at planning and development from a variety of perspectives. And he actually took on the position of head of Parks, Beaches,
Harbors, Beaches, Parks.
Harbors, yeah. In Irvine, they call it one thing, in Newport, they call it another, so yes. Harbors, Beaches, and Parks, and so he took his role, having started out at Caltrans, he went a long ways in the right direction. So my kudos to his family in his loss to cancer a few years ago.
Right.
And I think, you know, everybody went through some evolution in terms of their thinking and not their values, but their outlook and their perspective and what success was going to look like. And I think that's inevitable in this kind of a process. And I think it is fair to say, as you pointed out, Carol, that Donald Brent has a legacy of giving away a lot of open space. And it's also true that there were some emotions initially, and I'll just share this one story. I had two one-on-ones with Donald Brent, one at the very start of the process and one when there was an impasse in the negotiations. And the first time I met him, it was very intimidating because I came up to the 9th floor, the top floor of the building, and he had this private luncheon area, and I was warned that, you know, it'd be very stiff and not necessarily all lovey-dovey, and there would be a Pritikin lunch, whether I liked it or not, and there was. And I wasn't surprised because I always had this picture of him very svelte and standing stiff like a surfboard. But anyway, we sat down, and ultimately it was a very nice, productive, and professional meeting, although the very first words out of his mouth when I sat down was, do you think it's civilized that one of your city council members, referring to Lita, is picketing out front of my private home? And I was really a deer in the headlights. I thought that was an apropos metaphor given the canyon and everything. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. But it was kind of a showstopper for a minute, but I recovered and we had a productive conversation. But there was some emotion. And I also remember, was it Ray Watson? He was on the board of the Irvine Company at the time. He had been president of Disneyland, Democrat. But he really almost bit my head off one day, like, what's wrong with you people? 76% open space. He wasn't for it at all. So I know that I always thought, Carol, of you and of Gary Hunt as kindred spirits once we got into this process. I always felt like you really did want to find some positive outcome. And ultimately, it became clear that there was only one possible outcome, and that was a scenario where at least we had a shot at getting the whole enchilada, even though we didn't have the money lined up for all the options in the out years. Mike, you want to talk about, were there dramatic moments to you during the negotiations themselves when we were almost at a deal but not quite there?
I do recall that we had come to an impasse on things. Things seemed to be going well. The meetings were going well. People were producing a lot of good ideas. The company seemed interested and sincere, in my view. We could actually kind of see where the road was going, and that we just might be able to pull this off. And then I don't recall what the issue was. We hit an impasse on something, and it was one of the few meetings at the company facilities that really went badly. And from the environmental side, we actually said, well, this is not acceptable. Hell, I wish I could remember what the issue was now. But no, this is we're not going to go forward, and we just walked away. And I left the meeting thinking, well, I guess it's going to be back to the protesting, back to the picket lines, back to the company. I wasn't thinking about Mr. Brenn's house necessarily, but now I knew my way around the Irvine Company building a little bit, and Norm had a terrible idea that he should share later.
Norm did have a terrible idea.
It would have got us convicted on RICO statutes probably, but
it was one of these meetings that totally blew up. Paul was blindsided at the meeting, was so upset that we went at the time to Cedar Creek. Instantly.
The issue was overpriced, by the way. That was the impasse.
Instantly ordered two
wild turkeys.
Wild turkey. Downed him in rapid succession because he felt betrayed.
Don't try that at home, though.
And then, as we're talking about how we're going to get even, I came up with this idea that here's what we'll do. We'll barricade Fashion Island the day after Thanksgiving. We'll get everybody at Laguna Beach to drive their car up and park in the parking lot and leave.
And we're even going to count parking spaces. Like, well, let's see, we got 6,000 people out at the Canyon Walk. We could take up a lot of their parking and make sure that their tenants know that they're not going to sell anything that day. We're not going to buy anything. But cooler heads prevailed.
Yes.
Well, you know, cooler heads did prevail, and I think that a lot of that really was a testimony to Donald Brenn and Gary Hunt and Carol Hoffman at the time, because it would have been very easy to not have cooler heads, much less having them prevail. So,
but something people need. Mike said, and the negotiations broke off a couple times. Realize that the ballot measure was put on in mid-August. The arguments were written in mid-August. We didn't finish negotiations till early October.
October 7th.
And we were negotiating. I counted how many meetings we had, and it was like 3 a month until we hit late September, and then we met almost every day.
Yeah.
And I mean, the campaign was already on, and we didn't have a deal.
There were 21 official meetings of the group between April and early October of 1990, and of course there was a lot of running around in between those meetings, a lot of work being done. But it was rather remarkable, and it was unsettling to realize we had this measure on the ballot, and we were talking about it like we already had a deal, and in fact we didn't. And at one point, actually 10 days before the deal was done, I flew to Arizona to meet with you and Gary Hunt. They were at a meeting of the Irvine Health Foundation, I think.
We were at a board retreat, which we have annually, and the timing was so critical that we needed to meet. We didn't want to miss our retreat, but we didn't want to lose the momentum of the negotiations. And we sat in a little patio in one of our units, and there was a dry creek bed. And there was all this little wild animals going through the creek bed. And I thought, isn't that symbolic? I mean, isn't that sort of, prophetic that we're talking about protecting, other species in the canyon?
We were at the Boulders Resort, as I recall. And, it was kind of surreal sitting there, but we got things back on track. And then.
Well, one of the issues, as I recall, was that we wanted to set the stage for a productive discussion about the realignment of Laguna Canyon Road, not the Big Bend. We'd all agreed that that was off the table and never needed to happen, and nothing needed to occur on the southerly end of the roadway, but that we were hoping for a collaborative process for the realignment of Laguna Canyon Road, which was a separate process which followed later.
Right.
And I don't remember quite how that all transpired, but.
Well, I remember we were just getting totally hung up on which parcels where, how much money. And we went through so many permutations. We had meetings and people drawing on napkins of, we'll take this property. And what was interesting, the second poll we did, it said, let's push forward. And again, this was a poll only of Laguna Beach people, that we gave a choice to people and said basically, for $100, added taxes a year, you can buy everything you see. For $200, you can buy land, including the land that what we had defined as the entire canyon, which included land next to Leisure World that was out of the viewshed, out of the watershed. And Paul and I both had predicted, well, that's easy. People are going to pick the $100 one. Wasn't even close. It was like 80% said, no, we'll take the $200.
In fact, there were indications that
They would have paid more.
in a more modest scenario where we were picking up less open space, it could go down. I mean, we clearly realized that, we had to go for broke, so to speak.
The thing Mike's worrying, the Save the Canyon logo had so permeated, I think, the consciousness of everybody in the city that any suggestion of anything less than our redefinition of the canyon was viewed as a no. Astonishing degree.
One of the serendipitous things, to go back to your point about all these different scenarios about how to divide up the parcels and what we knew as an operating principle, we had to be able to tell voters, if you vote yes, here's what you get on day one, basically. And as long as we come up with these dollars in the out years, here's the next piece of land. And it had to be what you see is what you get. And so we did struggle with that. But serendipitously, the most developable land was the least interesting, environmentally speaking. That wouldn't necessarily have been the case. It was just dumb luck, really, that the most precious parts of the property were the least developable, and the least precious parts from an environmental point of view were the most developable. So we could push all this entitlement onto option years 4 and especially option year 5. That was just dumb luck. And at some point, we realized that.
Well, it also reflected good planning on our part from the land plan standpoint, but we didn't get any credit for that.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm in a bad cellar. I didn't hear that. But no, it was, I mean, really, you can be smart and lucky, and I think in that respect we were lucky because the natural conditions really made it easier for us to noodle our way through to a solution to what at first was really made my head swim to try to, I mean, we had 1 million iterations of which would be, which years and for how much money and all of that.
The last thing, when we finally reached an agreement on how the parcels were organized and everything else, we were all done, had a 3-page agreement. Everything was on 3 pages. And then as we're getting ready to leave, I think Gary says, what about the lawsuit? Are you going to drop it? And Liz said, no, we're not. And all of a sudden, we come to a dead halt. And, finally decided that we would drop it if the bond measure passed. So we made a contingent on the bond measure passing, and that's when that was the last hang-up. And it came like, I think most of us had forgotten it existed. Mm-hmm. But Gary remembered, so.
Now, when we finally reached a deal on October 7th, we decided to throw a party at the Hotel Laguna. And one of the things that I found sort of endearing about Donald Bren at that point is he was afraid to come to the party. He was afraid to come because he thought he'd be booed or, people would launch spitballs or whatever his particular fear was. And it was only after, I think, some persuading by Carol and Gary and the promise of a Laguna Greenbelt T-shirt that he would be able to don for the photograph that we made sure got full color on the front page of the LA Times, but it kind of tickled me that he wasn't sure he should go.
And you will recall that Earth First was quite active at that point in sort of California. And not particularly here, but they were really being quite violent in attacking sort of developers and chaining themselves to bulldozers and that sort of thing. And he did have a serious concern as to whether there was any Earth First constituents that would be part of this event. But I will tell you that the funniest part of it was there was not an Earth Firster that was going to attack Donald Bren. But as I stood there with Gary and Larry Thomas, who was our our media guy. And we were standing there near him as he got ready to speak, and all of a sudden a woman comes out of the group, forges through all three of us, and goes up to Mr. Bren and asks him to marry her. That was the last thing we could have expected, but on the other hand, the least harmful. So well, I think the record will show that he asked us to divert her.
So here it is, October 7th. We celebrate the deal being done at the Hotel Laguna. Some of us went across the street to dance. That's where I first met you, Tony. And then on October 8th, I awakened and realized, oh gosh, we have this campaign. Luckily for me, there wasn't time for them to really shop for another person to hire to run the campaign, so I got hired to run the campaign. And it was remarkable. I mean, I've worked, in New Hampshire for Gary Hart, setting them up with dates and stuff. I've worked at a number of campaign situations, and never before have I seen such a response from a community in short order. I mean, we sounded the alarm. We needed help. We had armies of volunteers, and we had enough volunteers, for example, that we could walk all the precincts twice and with 3 people to a team, and it was just highly organized. It was a beautiful thing, and mainly thanks to all the help that was forthcoming and the dedication to the cause. It was tricky, at first we realized we had to raise money, and as was often the case throughout this whole process, we realized we were looking at another two-edged sword. Let's see, who has money? The Irvine Company has money. Should we take their money? How will that play in the campaign? And then it came to our attention that I thought this was kind of an interesting backstory, if you will. I guess you'll be the judge of that. The school community had been talking about doing a bond measure, and indeed, ultimately, they did, the first of 2. The concern was, if we do this thing, then we'll never be able to go to the well again. And so we realized that one of our most urgent needs as a practical matter was to try to engage the leadership of school power and other elements of the school community and try to persuade them of the idea that, no, this won't compromise your efforts, actually it'll help your efforts, because success begets success. We'll all organize, we'll be successful, we'll celebrate, and then we'll go on to the next challenge. And that's a good thing, and happily at the time, enough of them bought into that idea that we were able to recruit some of that leadership.
I think Mike has a story on that with the school board.
And I don't recall whether or not we wanted their name on the ballot argument, but we were into the campaign, and we had talked about it would be great to have their name or one of the school board names on some of our documents. And I don't recall if it was even the ballot argument or not. So I made a call to a particular board member of the school board and made my pitch about what we were looking for. And her answer was, I don't know, let me get back to you. And to her credit, she did quickly. And her answer was, no, and she had gotten some advice, and no, we're not going to be involved in this. We don't think we should be. So I picked up the phone and I called Dan Kenny, who was still on the city council, and I sort of laid this out to him. He goes, really? She said that? What's her phone number? And I gave him the phone number and said, I wonder how this is going to go. And 5 minutes later, I got a call from Dan saying, go ahead, put her name on it. She says yes. And it was just a great lesson in small town practical politics, getting things done.
for me, there are several things that I really remember about the campaign. One was the Army of Volunteers. We worked out of Nolan Realty. We had phone banks. We had everything going. Another thing I remember was we called them the Burma Shave signs. We had signs out in the canyon about all kinds of things related to voting yes on Measure H to save the canyon. And I would say that, you know, again, trying to think about what were the real ingredients for success. One of them was that half the town drove through the canyon twice a day. I mean, I think that was a huge thing. I think another thing, and perhaps in contrast to our more recent failed open space measure on a ballot here, there was an imminent threat. I mean, everybody understood, and it was a palpable thing. Everybody knew, you vote yes, the bulldozers don't show up. You vote no, they're going to show up lickety-split. And that was real, and everybody accepted that as a given. And I think that was hugely important, that everybody felt like this was, there was an urgency, there was a familiarity with the property, even by people who didn't commute regularly to and from city that way. And I think as well, there was a tremendous advantage as a function of all the media coverage from the time that of the walk and the tell to my being retained. And I mean, we even had, you know, there was a couple months there where we were on the front page of the LA Times just talking about what was going on with the negotiations. And I think, you know, another part of the success was we all agreed, the negotiating team, on a very strict management of the media. I mean, at the end of sometimes to the group's chagrin, of course, I've been known as a controlling person anyway in this department, but it was really remarkable. Everybody agreed on this discipline, and we all stuck to it. At the end of every meeting, we would say, okay, what are we going to say about what happened today? Who's going to say it?
And what are we not going to say about
what
happened
today? Not going to say. And I think as a result of that team effort, we just had so much free, positive media that by the time the deal was struck, and then so quickly thereafter comes the time to vote, and people, I think, naturally, having seen this conflict play out, were therefore that much more eager to embrace the deal.
You can see that in that headline. That was the Daily Pilot the day after that says Laguna Canyon saved. It wasn't until the vote came, but they ran a headline, and again, it sets a psychological view for people that it's just the natural thing. I mean, Mike was telling me that there was an event they held to show everybody what their taxes would be, and nobody showed up because they didn't have to.
Yeah. Paul said, did you get the press release out? Nobody came. What's going on? And we held it over at the Boys and Girls Club, and the idea was you bring us your property tax assessment, and we'll tell you what your share is going to be.
Because remember, this was an ad valorem tax, the typical kind of bond measure. So what you paid was a function of your assessed value. We always talked about an average of $250 a year, when in fact some people were going to pay a lot more than that. But yeah, so we made this available, and nobody came. And we didn't know what to make of that in the moment. Was that because nobody cared, like they weren't going to even vote, or because nobody cared like they were going to vote, they were for it, they didn't even need to be bothered but with such particulars? We didn't know. We were pretty confident we were going to win by mid to late October.
But you had no idea you were going to win by 80%.
No.
It was the most remarkable outcome of a bond measure in the state of California in over 30 years.
Well, to be specific, it's, and I think this is still, I think it still holds a record, but I may be wrong about that. At the time, it was the third highest vote for a property tax hike in California history. The first two were early on in the 1900s, like I think it was, one was for a library or a school in San Francisco, and I forget what the other one was for. But it was 79.7%, nearly 80%. We knew we had a shot, based on the very last poll we did, to really bump up the level of support. And we wrestled a lot within the campaign organization about whether to spend another $50,000 to punch up that vote, and the decision was made to do that, the thinking being, well, you know, it's one thing to win by 67%, but with an eye to these out years where we don't yet have the dough in hand, and they have the right to build if we don't produce the money in a timely fashion, it was like, well, the phrase I think I used at the time was, this isn't a political insurance policy. If we can really pump up the margin of victory, that'll probably buy us some flexibility and goodwill, and so that's what we did. We really went all out. And we did some, what at the time were novel things. We had one big mailer, I guess was the first main mailer, and if you look on here, that I don't know whether the people at home can see this, if you can shift the camera or not, but anyway, this framed poster, but that's basically the size it unfolded. It arrived in the mail oversized. At the time, you hadn't seen a direct mail piece that size. And then when it unfolded, it was like kind of an Ansel Adams looking thing on one side with some more emotional verbiage to evoke sort of the spirit of the thing. And then on the back side was a full color explanation of how the program was really work. What does it mean, the option payments, how much? It had some vignettes, some color photos of the lake and whatnot. And one of the tricky things about creating this was, one thing we had failed to do early on was get some good photographs in place with an eye to the coming campaign. And it was a drought. The canyon was kind of parched. And then now it's late summer. And so we got this fellow, oh, I apologize, I can't think of his name, very good, Walter Urey, pretty good photographer, and we said, we want to try to create the feeling of an Ansel Adams photo, and he said, it's so brown out there, you know, it's not going to look so good. I said, we'll do it in black and white, and he said, well, it's still not going to look so good. That's, what do you call it, infrared. So he went out there around daybreak, I think, and shot it in infrared, and that's why it looks as nice as it does. And then again on the back was a full color explanation of how it worked, and I think that was a good positive step to start the campaign, and we got a lot of positive response from that. I think another thing that was interesting to me was we had opposition from the Laguna Beach taxpayers. We had a series of debates. And, you know, one of the things Carol mentioned up front was how good it made her feel that she made friends out of this process, and those friends remained friends. And really, apropos that comment, I would say, you know, I went around debating. It was John Brand. What was his name?
Brand.
Yeah. He and I were the pro side of the debates. We had a bunch of them. I forget how many. 10 or 12 at least, maybe more. And then for the taxpayers, it was Art Casepier and Jack Hefty, who started out, some people are laughing, I think because, you know, these were characters and they could be very upset and dramatic. We just got along great, pretty much from the get-go, and we became friends. And it was a very sort of agreeable disagreement, and we went around with our little show debating the pros and cons, and it was utterly unlike politics today at the national, state, or local level, I'm sorry to say. It was just... yeah,
they were true gentlemen.
They were gentlemen, and everybody, there was goodwill on both sides, and it became, you know, we all became friends out of it. It was quite remarkable in that respect. I think another interesting thing, just talking about the campaign, we decided we need to buttress our economic arguments, so we decided to try to hire, excuse me, someone who had been known as the guy developers go to try to document the benefits, economic benefits of their projects, and I don't remember his name. He was like the guru, saying we had him calculate what the increase in property value would likely be as a function of more open space from the Laguna Canyon purchase. And he had some calculation, and I don't recall what it was, but the bottom line was, he said, you know, more open space will actually help increase your property values.
And we use that in a different way, because since it was an ad valorem tax, your tax would drop every year. So we made use of that fact that even though it's 20 years, by the time you reach year 20, it's dropped considerably.
Yeah, in other words, we structured it so we actually were transparent and responsible about it, much to everybody's surprise, I think. But we set it up so that we had to raise only so much money to service the debt each year. We pulled $20 million forward by pledging that property tax increment. But each year, so long as property values were rising, and there was some number of new homes each year on the rolls, that, as Norm said, the actual cost to each person would go down. So by the end of the time, I mean, Carolyn, what was your last tax bill? Do you remember on Laguna Laurel? How much? 6 cents? Really? Boy, we did structure that cleverly.
Yes.
But I know it went down appreciably.
Paul, I started about $300 a year. I assumed I was paying $300 a year until I looked, and it was maybe not 6 cents, but because of the people buying and selling houses and the new people and the tax base going up, it fell way down.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm sure it was
well
cut
over
by more
half,
than half.
well over-
yeah,
it was
well,
about a third,
yeah,
I think is.
Yeah. So it ended up being a pretty good value for dollar.
Paul, this is the Historical Society, and we have had a program before about the Laguna Beach County Water District 1925 bond issue that passed unanimously.
Unanimously?
Yeah, something like 394 to nothing. The justice of the peace that morning went out and he turned the brackish water so that every voter who turned on their tap got brackish water, and it passed unanimously.
But it wasn't a city
Wow.
then, so.
So that was 1925?
Yeah.
So 2 years before incorporation?
$600,000 paid off in 1955.
Wow. Wow.
I want to tell a cute anecdote, and it has to do with this painting right here. It's actually a print, and it's called Laguna Heat. And you'll notice that on the marquee in the downtown theater is the movie called Laguna Heat, and that was the book written by T. Jefferson Parker, and it was made into a movie. And this is a painting by Laguna Beach architect Michael Laverly. Well, when I was doing the presentation at the Board of Supervisors for the Laguna Laurel Development Agreement, he had done a painting, which many of you may have seen, which showed the canyon being destroyed by development and the corridor having two little, clover leaves with a little cow on one and these high-rise buildings spewing pollutants into the air as the only thing that was going to be left in the canyon after, we proceeded with our development. And
That's it?
yeah, that's probably it.
It's entitled, Thank God They Saved the Canyon.
Yeah, but he presented that in front of the Board of Supervisors, and frankly, that's a little different than the one I remember, but it's probably close. And he presented that in such a way, with such emotion, that the executives around me felt that he was drug crazed. And that I was probably in jeopardy. And luckily, we had two executives at the company that were about 6'6". And they felt it necessary to escort me out to the parking lot because they were afraid that I was going to be, assaulted in some respect. And so when we had the celebratory event at the Hotel Laguna, downstairs we had a little bit of an art auction, and a number of the local artists very generously donated their pieces, and I felt that I wanted to contribute toward the ultimate fundraising. And so I looked at this piece by Michael Laverly, who I thought had put me in harm's way. And when I saw Laguna Heat as the name of the piece, I thought, you know, I took a lot of heat in Laguna. And so this hangs over my desk in my office to this day. And it always evokes a wonderful story that I can share with people about the heat in Laguna and the way in which we came to, you know, very successful negotiations thanks to a lot of you. The other thing that I brought tonight also hangs in my office, and that is this wonderful black and white Ansel Adams type photography. And it was presented to me when I left the board of the Laguna Canyon Conservancy. I'm sorry, the Laguna Canyon Foundation, and I served on that board for 10 years, and my role really was not being the black hat developer, but rather to serve as a resource for ideas about future funding and so forth. So when it came time for me to make room on the foundation board for others, this was a gift that was given to me, and it hangs on the opposite side of my wall, along with pictures of other development projects that I get a chance to work on. So I just wanted to bring them tonight and share them with all of you. I don't know if the viewers out in watching on television can see those, but I wanted those memories to be shared. The other thing is, Norm pointed out, this Daily Pilot article was one which we framed for all of the negotiating committee's records, and it really did recount the success of those negotiations in saving the canyon. I actually have two of those. One of them was when I worked on the Newport Coast project, and we negotiated with the Friends of what was then called Irvine Coast. Terry Watt and Gene Watt and many others, and Elizabeth was a part of that group, but we were able to resolve a lawsuit with 9 environmental groups and achieve the support of the Friends of the Coast when we got the approval of the Newport Coast through the Coastal Commission. And I have a similar headline, environmentalists support the coast. So those two things are real milestones in my career, and one that I've been very proud, the both of which I've been very proud to represent the Irvine Company. So I have to put a plug in for them, because all of the emotions that run in the room, perhaps, or in the community, they really do a lot of the very good and right things.
The other thing you brought were cookies. You want to talk about the cookies?
Oh, yes. The cookies are my gift to you this evening, and Norm reminded me that I sort of have a trademark of cookies. And I've always felt that when you break bread with people, it helps break down the animosity or the concerns, and it got to the point where I didn't dare show up at a meeting without cookies, because things would have really gone awry. In fact, when I left the Irvine Company, I was there twice, actually, and in 79 to 81, and when I left in 81, I had been doing a lot of work with the city of Irvine, and the Irvine Transportation Commission used to work long and late, and so I brought these cookies to keep myself awake, much less to keep the Transportation Commission awake. And so when I left, they gave me a plaque of appreciation, and they had a big cookie shellacked onto the plaque to the cookie lady. So it's been working for me for a long time. Well,
we used to joke that there was something in the cookies. Clearly, as Mike alluded to earlier, the different, I mean, the gestalt of the situation in the trailers versus in the Irvine Company with the sandwiches and the cookies. Now, I will say, Ken Frank, if you're watching, which I doubt, he probably is looking at other program alternatives, but Ken would never touch the cookies. Or the sandwiches. Ken would never eat the sandwiches. Ken wouldn't have, maybe he had a cup of coffee. I'm not sure. But
paid for it, though.
he was, you know, it was funny because he had a portfolio which was $65 million, and we ended up at a higher number than that. And as was Ken's signature, and I had never worked with Ken before this, I didn't really view him as somebody who was helping to push the ball down the field on these negotiations until it was clear that we had reached the end point. There were 3 votes, And then he just couldn't have been more helpful in identifying clever ways to help finance it. There was a parking bond and some other arcane stuff that he was able to cobble together, and resources he was able to husband, and just made everything go beautifully thereafter. And then when we got into memorializing our agreement in principle, which Norm mentioned earlier was 3 pages, and then hold up this thing. This is the final agreement, and that's closer to 3 inches. And we got into all kinds of funny issues, like mineral rights, for example. And,
we argued about slant drilling.
Slant drilling, like where could they drill from the city of Irvine to get their rights? There wasn't going to be any drilling in the canyon. I mean, we got into fairly arcane.
You see why we had to have cookies to keep the energy levels up.
All right.
It was awful. This was not fun. The others were this was not fun.
No, that was pretty mundane. I mean, not mundane, but
Tedious.
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 Any other anecdotes, Mike? You have.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned those cookies, because they're the stuff of legend. And when we first started the negotiations, a lot of the Canyon people said, be very careful when you go over to the Irvine Company, because they will be so hospitable and so nice to you, and they'll ply you with things, and before you know it, you'll start to take their side of the things, and you'll start arguing with your rank and file on their behalf. And I was determined that wasn't going to happen, and like Ken, I think I resisted for a while. But, you know, you'd be at those meetings quite late, and they had these Meyerhoff cookies that were a brown...
They're in the
she
far
brought
corner
some?
over there.
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
Save one for Mike. Yeah.
They're a thick, brown, dense brownie cookie with white sugar powder, and those things could get you through an evening, and I don't really care for sweets, but these things were amazing. And at the end of some of the meetings, there would be some leftover food. Carol was always great. And by the way, they were incredibly hospitable the entire time. That was absolutely true in a good way. But I brought a few of those cookies home and shared some with my wife, and a friend of mine who happened to be there and who had a real sweet tooth, and I said, here, you've got to try one of these. He tried that cookie, and he just kind of went off into a dreamland, and he said, Michael, these people are going to win. You might as well stop. Anyone that has these kinds of cookies is going to win. I would want to say, because I never got a chance to say it, Carol, how great you were, and how often I've thought back on those meetings, how incredibly patient you were with us trying to get to a solution. I always found it very hard not to dislike you. It was over time I saw her as part of the group, and there were a lot of good, valuable lessons for me that came out of those negotiations, and how to work with people, how to try and stay patient when things aren't going very well, and those were good examples.
Thank you so much.
Could we talk about Parcel 5? We have a map down here, which is thanks to Max Barella, the executive director of the Laguna Canyon Foundation. And, you know, it took a long time to get Parcel 5. And I would speak to my wife many times. I said, they're going to run us out of town. I said, we taxed ourselves. We increased our property taxes 6%. Bing, 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 we get Parcel 1, 2, and 3. I was chatting about this to Norm. I said, if we don't get Parcel 5, there's 1,500 homes that are going to be built. It's going to be a surprise to everybody, and we're going to have to move. So when I was all excited, Norm said, calm down, Gene. We have that all covered.
Well, I have to say that I don't think your wife trusted me till the very last minute of you getting the last parcel. I think she was going to be a holdout to the very end.
She voted against the Laguna Canyon realignment project, Laguna Canyon Road project.
Well, I think, you know, to your point, Gene, or your question, we knew that the cost of the option parcel 5 was prohibitive. We also had a good idea it was going to be impossible to come up with the full amount that we'd agreed to, that we just couldn't, we didn't have the money and we couldn't see how we would get the money. And it was our hope that given our the margin of victory, future bond measures, ultimately the goodwill that had been built up over the years, Bren's generosity, and all of those things did come together. And again, kind of dumb luck, though. There was a relevant statewide bond measure that passed and provided some of those monies that the Irvine Company had banked on, and then the rest was really a gift.
It was, and we knew there was a risk. We had structured the deal so that the parcel 5 was next to Leisure World, out of what people could see, and we knew it was a risk at the time. Because I can remember calling Neil Fitzpatrick, who was on council at the time, and saying, we've cut a deal. And he said, how much? I said, 78. And he goes, we only authorized 65. I said, we get all the good stuff first. We get the stuff we really want at the beginning, and we just have to hope at the end.
Which was another two-edged sword. In other words, yes, we got all the stuff, the really good stuff at the beginning. However, a lot of that good stuff that we got at the beginning was the open space that the company was going to dedicate anyway. And people would say, why would we be giving them $30 million for what they were going to give us for nothing? So we were very keen in the negotiations to make sure that even in the first year, there was land taken down that otherwise would have been developed, and that in every year there would be entitlement that would go away with the payment. But there was no other way to structure this deal, and happily that particular issue never really got a critical mass and took hold, although that was a big fear of ours. Ultimately the outcomes, I think, were extraordinary. The 79%, as Carol mentioned, for the vote.
We keep calling it 80%.
Yeah, we'll call it 80%.
Almost 80.
Almost 80.
You can round off.
Yeah, I think on my resume it's like 88%. I don't know. I'm not sure. Gilding the lily, as we used to say in the South. But, it really set the stage, I think, for positive interactions between environmentalists and the Irvine Company around the whole county. It set the stage ultimately for the Greenbelt Authority and what is now, I think I'm right in saying, is the nation's second largest urban wilderness park with roughly 21,000 acres. Is that the right number?
You say 22,000.
22,000, and this was in effect the buckle, if you will, for the Greenbelt. So that was huge, and so I think it's really a remarkable story. I mean, when I would tell people back east that I was involved in this effort to have the city tax itself for 20 years to buy land that wasn't even in the city, people found it hard to believe. It's
an incredible commitment when you think about it and compare it to other areas where we did not ask them to give us the land. We bought it. And it says a lot. It's a model that we haven't seen any other city being able to match. Some have tried, but San Juan Capistrano has passed some stuff. They've come close. But
well, Lita Lenny asked them to give it away for nothing.
Yes, she did.
Yeah, she
did. And
was
more than once.
And was upset when she realized they wouldn't. And it was just a major effort in the fact that the city came together at that level.
Well, what I'd like to do for this historical presentation tonight, and because I know you're recording it, would be just to read off the names of all the signatories to the document. And, of course, from the Irvine Company was Gary Hunt and Carol Hoffman. And from the city of Laguna Beach, Ken Frank. From the Greenbelt, Elizabeth Brown and Norm Grossman. From Laguna Canyon Conservancy, Carolyn Wood. From the Laguna Canyon property owners, then Sandy Lucas, and Susan Gallagher from Sea and Sage Audubon Society, And from Village Laguna, Cy Jones and Paul Freeman, Michael Phillips, Brian Jacobs, Lita Lenny, and Bob Gentry. So thanks to a very large group of people who hung in there and made all of this happen, some of whom have gone on to other locations and other areas, but many of whom are still very active here and helping make good things happen for Laguna.
Is there an opportunity for questions, Gene?
Yes, when people have questions. Let me ask one because I'm interested in the picketing of the entrance to Linda Isle, Donald Brenn's home. Paul said that you met with Mr. Brenn and he mentioned it. Well, the picketing occurred at least a year prior. And so that was, of course, the Laguna Canyon Conservancy was founded in 1988. And what are we going to do? We're threatened by the toll road. We're threatened by the widening of Big Bend. We're threatened by the Laguna Laurel project. And a councilwoman, Lita Lenny, the founder of the Laguna Canyon Conservancy, said, let's picket. Well, where are we going to picket? Let's picket Donald Brenn's house. And as we talked about it, the idea was that the Irvine Company is publicity sensitive, and that they might respond to that. So is that true, Carol? Did that work?
He said it didn't make a difference.
And then what we did was to picket along Laguna Canyon Road. And the plan
had much more of an impact, I
the
will say.
plan was to have outreach and to have people be aware of the threat. And so one of the people who stopped by saying, "What's going on?" was Harry Huggins, who, was not aware that this threat existed, but thanks to our picketing, he stopped by and got involved. And at the time, the property was outside the city of Laguna Beach, and then we annexed it later. It's still outside the city of Laguna Beach?
Unfortunately.
So this is recorded, so if you want to ask a question, come up here like the city council thing, or Ed can give it to you, but coming up here is fine too. I do want to mention several names were mentioned. Mark Chamberlain is here, and his partner Jerry Birchfield. They worked for years documenting Laguna Canyon and the threat to it. And so this 600-plus foot tell was made up of 100,000 individual photographs which were donated from people all over, which Jerry Birchfield, who died a few years ago, and Mark Chamberlain, and all his volunteers put together to, starting on May Day, and then on Armistice Day, November 11th, 1989, was the walk in the canyon going out there. Does anybody have a question? Okay.
Carol, Barbara Diamond.
Barbara, how are you?
Hi. You said that that when negotiations, when you first started talking, the recession was kind of imminent, and that has an effect on developers. But the Irvine Company was not a developer at that time. They sold to merchant builders at that time more than developed properties themselves. Did other developers have any input to Donald Brenn at that time?
Not really, but we had to be able to have builders that could afford to buy our land. And after this negotiation and we were developing in other areas, we actually had to hire builders and paid them a fee in order to build some homes because they couldn't afford to buy our property. And so there was a whole different way of doing business during that recession, and that has occurred during recessions since, actually, Barbara.
Paul, you mentioned the Burma Shave signs. So this is, we scanned in the Laguna Canyon book. This was done by Sharon Heath. And in it, acknowledging various people, it includes the Laguna Phantom. Now, have we ever found out who the Laguna Phantom is?
Gene, everybody knows.
Well, I'm not at liberty to say who the Laguna Phantom is. I don't know. I think we do know who it is. So.
Is there anybody here who doesn't know?
Tony, do you have any idea who the Laguna Phantom is?
Are there any examples of the Burma shave signs? Because they really were very clever. I don't have a record of that either, but they were very clever.
For people that might not have been here or don't remember, it was everything from, 3,000 homes here, golf course here, and then the more traditional thing you might associate with Burma shave, there would be some sentences, I forget what it was, like
Yes.
save the canyon, that
But
kind
before
of
that, I did sell some as a fundraiser because foolishly in 1990 I ran for council, and those were the Phantom donated signs for a fundraiser for me. So somebody has them, at least one set.
The first bit of poetry was done by Cy Jones, and we were sitting at a Greenbelt, or was it Village Laguna? It was at a Village Laguna meeting, and I said, oh, I have a really good idea. Why doesn't somebody put some Burma shave signs in the canyon? And then I waited for somebody to do it. I found out a lot at that point that I'd have to do it myself. So, but he wrote it, see the hills, the open space, they'll disappear without a trace, the Irvine Company. And then there was one that was a little hostile at Christmas, and that was Bah Humbug Donald Scrooge. And then I was working at Irvine High at the time, and Norm Grossman's responsible for the name Phantom. I don't know if you remember that, yeah. Because Irvine's a company town, and I knew that the principal would be, if this was really seen as hostile, he'd be giving me a bad time, so I couldn't tell anybody. And that, of course, made it more fun, right? And that's when the Phantom of the Opera was going, so you came up with Phantom. But it turned out there were reporters lurking in the canyon hoping to find us when we go out at night. And there was someone, the night of Lita Lenny's get-together on, saving the canyon, someone came up to me and implied that she was the Phantom, which I got a big kick out of, because, it's just like you learn so much about human nature and something like that. But no, I'll have to work on some of the poetry that was done. But it was fun. Ken Frank took them down immediately.
So Tony Eisman was the Phantom of the Canyon. Current Councilwoman Tony Eisman.
Interesting how political careers are born, huh, Tony?
Any other questions from anybody?
Well, I certainly hope that we've shared memories that have evoked responses in you that maybe you'd forgotten about, and I hope we haven't slighted anybody because there were so many contributors. And I think of Carolyn Wood's files and how incredible they are. And are you still living with all those files there? Yes.
I'm sure.
If ever,
no doubt about that.
If we ever needed a piece of paper that was part of the history of anything to do with all of this, Carolyn Wood had it in a file, and she could put her hand on it immediately. And, of course, Elizabeth Brown, with her incredible leadership of the Greenbelt over those many years. And, she actually came to a party at my house one night, but she doesn't drive the corridor.
Hi, my name's Harry Huggins. I wanted to remind everybody that at that time there was a thing going on not only in Laguna but all around the county and across the nation. Had something to do with women's power and women's lib. And I want you to know that part of my motivation for being so involved had a lot to do with women in this town. Lita Lenny, top of the list. One person who's not here, Linda Ekman. She was very enthusiastic. Of course, Elizabeth Brown next to me, and Carolyn Wood. Every woman had their own power dynamic going on that were cohesive. It worked well together. I just want to say that I think that was a new dynamic that was going on in town. It just seemed like it was. Maybe I was just new to the horizon of women's lib, but I think it was that birth of the late 80s that was happening, and more were being elected to office, more were finding their own power. And Carol, you as well, a dynamic representative for the Irvine Company. You did make people like you, even when we didn't want to. I mean, you had that power. You knew how to do that. So I must say that was a part of what went on at the same time, too, and how the whole dynamics played out.
I wasn't going to, but there is something that I should remind people of, is that as great as this was for Laguna Canyon and for Laguna Beach, it made a lot more stuff possible that would not have happened. We now have the Nature Reserve of Orange County, which is 38,000 acres in 2 big chunks. And it was only possible because we had all this great open space that we had spent all this time putting together. And that's the Coastal Reserve. And then there's the Central Reserve. But the thing is, a great idea spreads. This was a great idea, and Laguna Beach and their devotion and tenacity, and you know, the fact that we had great opponents was lucky for us. But the fact is, this was a terrific idea that has kept going since. It just keeps going. And you know, everybody here who was part of it and up there should understand that it you know, it keeps paying forward. And that's the best part of this.
Thank you. There's another question in back there.
While the mic is getting back there, let me mention that Mike Phillips is wearing the diamond Save Laguna Canyon, which was designed by Steve Zoller, the artist. And we have stickers on the table here, so make sure you take one.
Just a comment on what does the future hold? The canyon's beautiful.
Can you help him turn that mic on? On the
Hello. Question, what does the future hold for Laguna Canyon? Beautiful space, incredible legacy you've helped create. Really makes Laguna unique. But I read that Irvine is the fastest growing, the fifth fastest growing city in the country. And traffic is obviously increasing. What does the future hold? What can your wise minds tell us about how to solve that dilemma and be able to enjoy the canyon without worrying about getting through the canyon?
Who wants to tackle that? I'll let the planning commissioner tackle that question.
As far as what the future holds for Laguna Canyon, that's what this document ensures, is that it stays the way it is. The road has been widened to 2 lanes each way. It'll stay that way. The canyon will stay the way it is. It's managed by the county. The way this developed, there is no incentive for anybody to ever do anything because the county can't do any development in the canyon or else it reverts back to the Irvine Company. That's how this is structured. So there's no reason to ever have anything happen there. We've put in as much protection as we can to ensure that it remains undeveloped, period.
So even if Irvine grows dramatically, the only outcome, I'm afraid, is that traffic will worsen on Laguna Canyon Road. It's not going to be changed.
I will say that there's a term called planned deficiency. And one of the things that we dealt with in the approvals for the Newport Coast was to recognize that Laguna did not want Coast Highway widened. And that meant that there would be traffic that had to be accommodated, but it was a trade-off. So just like Corona Del Mar doesn't want Coast Highway widened through Corona Del Mar, that means that traffic will be slower there. Now, a friend of mine said, yeah, but then that allows us to drive slow enough that we can see girls in bathing suits walking by. But the fact is that there are areas where conscious decisions are being made by communities who acknowledge that in the summertime, in beach communities, there's going to be traffic. And there will be peak times when it's worth it to live where we live in order to have a little traffic or a lot of traffic in order to enjoy that privilege. So those planned deficiencies are the realities of what we live with. And if you're living in San Juan Capistrano and you work in Irvine, you at least have a couple of choices how to get to work. And that has helped. But in the canyon, it would be a conscious decision to you preserve and you limit and you restrict, and therefore there will be traffic congestions at particular times.
And in fact, even the realignment and widening of Laguna Canyon Road, which was very controversial, and Mike and I talked about this earlier today because Mike still thinks it was a big mistake, and I can see why, but we made a conscious decision there and fought very hard with Caltrans to keep the road from being a straight-through, easy-to-traverse highway. In fact, I think a lot of us are still upset the road doesn't curve more, because if it curved more, people would be forced to drive slower. It's, as far as I'm concerned, it's way too straight. But there was major fight that there's no lighting out there, there's no fences, and that took a major effort all the way up to Washington in some cases to ensure that that happened. So I think you'll continue to see a commitment to keep the canyon what it is.
Okay, so I think we need to wrap up, and I'd like Oh, we got Mark Chamberlain. We don't want to miss that. Go ahead, Mark.
Okay, I didn't come planning to talk, but I've really been enjoying listening to all of these twists and turns of this whole episode, and it's brought back for me a lot of things. Seeing all the faces, Elizabeth and Carol, and all of you that we dealt with so much over that crucial time period. But I should mention, too, that Ron Chilcote, someone that many of you people are aware of with the Laguna Wilderness Press, he and I have started talking about putting out a long overdue book on the Laguna Canyon project that Jerry and I undertook in 1980. A lot of people thought the tell just sprang from nowhere, but no, it was 8 years in formation. And we finished the Laguna Canyon project the year after Jerry died in 2010. So that became a 30-year undertaking over these things that we've been talking about tonight. But the project also, before Jerry passed away, we undertook another project that was documenting the El Toro Marine Corps Air Station's transformation into the Great Park of Orange County. And our ambition there was that we'd continue this kind of environmental artivism, is what I call it, that would hopefully lead to the promise of the Great Park to create a wilderness corridor that would connect with the Laguna Canyon wilderness to the southwest, that would connect with the San Bernardino Mountains to the northeast, so that Laguna would have a major influence on the natural landscape of this whole region in terms of creating wilderness space for the future. And the Great Park, by the way, I think you all know is in great trouble right now, the promise for it. So if any of you have the inclination to get involved in that, now is the time to get re-engaged. Thank you.
I just wanted to say that I'm so happy about how many times you've mentioned Lita Lenny in this panel, because she seems to be somewhat of a forgotten figure. And in the publicity, and I just want to say how much she inspired me, and I think how much she inspired a lot of us. I still remember that day when she stood up there in the city council chambers and said, "We are going to save Laguna Canyon," and there was no turning back from her enthusiasm. And I think the heritage of this whole effort is not only in saving the canyon, but inspiring the next generation of activists and making us all never give up. And I hope we all keep on doing that. Save the garden.
I think it's been a very interesting, a great program, and please join me in thanking Paul Freeman, Norm Grossman, Carol Mentor McDermott, and Mike Phillips.